Most people think they know the names of history's worst killers. But the truth? Some of the most ruthless monsters are the ones almost no one talks about. In Connecticut, a drifter turned his van into a traveling chamber of death, leaving behind bodies in a patch of woods the locals would later call the killing fields. Centuries earlier, a hermit stalked starving villages in France, dragging children into the forests and earning the terrifying name the werewolf of Dole. And in the 1920s, landladies across North America opened their doors to what looked like a polite young tenant, only to meet the brute strength of a predator who strangled dozens in their own boarding houses. These are three of the most unheard yet ruthless killers in history. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because these stories will stay with you long after they end. In the summer of 2003, the quiet city of New Britain, Connecticut, became the backdrop for one of the most disturbing cases in modern American true crime. A case so ruthless, yet so little spoken of, that it remained buried in obscurity for years. The killer was William Howell, a drifter and handyman who outwardly looked like just another man trying to get by. But Howell's world was not about work, family, or community. His world revolved around violence, control, and death. He drove a beaten-down blue Ford Econoline van that seemed harmless on the outside, yet inside it became what he chillingly described as his murder mobile. Neighbors and acquaintances thought he was odd but unremarkable, the kind of man who blended into the background, never drawing attention, which made him all the more dangerous. Howell targeted some of society's most vulnerable women, often those struggling with addiction, poverty, or homelessness, women who could disappear without drawing the immediate alarm of authorities. He picked them up with offers of rides, money, or companionship, then turned his van into a trap from which there was no escape. The van was rigged not just for transport, but for confinement, with curtains over the windows, tools stashed away, and a cold determination driving the man behind the wheel. Howell murdered at least 7 women in that single year, keeping their bodies in his van for days at a time before eventually disposing of them in a wooded patch of land behind a strip mall. It was this hidden burial ground that investigators would later call the killing fields of Connecticut. What made Howell especially chilling was his casual cruelty. He treated his victims as if they were disposable, sometimes referring to them as trophies in conversations with confidants, boasting about the way he had complete control over life and death inside that vehicle. While the rest of New Britain went about its summer in 2003, families at barbecues, children playing in the streets, Howell was driving through those same roads with bodies hidden in the back of his van, already thinking about his next victim. It would take years before the scale of his crimes came to light. But even then, investigators would later say the horror lay not only in the murders themselves, but in how Howell lived so comfortably with death, riding silently just behind him, as though it were no different from carrying a toolbox or groceries. For nearly a decade, William Howell's crimes remained hidden beneath the surface of New Britain, Connecticut. His victims lost to the silence of the woods and the neglect of a system that barely noticed they were gone. The women he targeted were often struggling with poverty, addiction, or homelessness, and their disappearances failed to trigger the kind of urgency that might have exposed him sooner. Howell counted on this invisibility. He preyed on the forgotten, confident that their absences would not spark the headlines or manhunts that follow more privileged victims. But in 2007, 4 years after his killings, the first clue began to emerge. A hunter walking through a patch of overgrowth behind a strip mall stumbled upon human remains, a grim discovery that immediately drew police to the area. Forensic teams combed the site and found more remains scattered across the thick brush and soil, bones hidden beneath leaves and shallow dirt. Still, the investigation stalled. With no clear suspect and no immediate way to tie the remains together, the killings remained a mystery. What no one knew was that Howell, arrested in 2005 for an unrelated manslaughter charge, had already been bragging to a cellmate about his crimes. He described his van as his murder mobile, telling the cellmate how he killed women, kept their bodies inside with him for days, sometimes even sleeping beside them, before eventually dumping them in the woods. The detail was so grotesque that it seemed unbelievable at the time, the kind of story criminals tell behind bars to inflate their own notoriety. But as police continued to investigate the remains found in 2007, the horrifying truth began to align with Howell's casual confessions. Over the next several years, forensic technology advanced, allowing investigators to link the scattered remains to 7 missing women, all last seen in 2003. When police finally connected the dots, Howell's chilling admissions to fellow inmates transformed into evidence that could no longer be ignored. In 2015, more than a decade after the murders, Howell was finally charged with 6 counts of murder on top of his earlier manslaughter conviction. Prosecutors laid out the story. A drifter who turned a van into a death chamber. A man who dumped bodies in a patch of woods behind a strip mall as though human lives were no more than garbage to discard. The community of New Britain, long haunted by whispers of the killing fields, was forced to confront the reality that for months in 2003, one man had treated their streets, their stores, their ordinary neighborhoods as a hunting ground, and that his van, parked in broad daylight at times, had been carrying secrets too terrible to imagine. When William Devon Howell finally stood in court in 2017, 14 years after his killing spree, the details of his crimes spilled out like a nightmare that had been sealed too long. Prosecutors described how Howell targeted vulnerable women, using his van as a mobile trap, killing them inside before leaving their bodies in the woods behind a New Britain strip mall. Survivors and relatives filled the courtroom, listening as Howell's own words were read aloud. Chilling confessions he had made to cellmates about how he slept next to the bodies of his victims, calling them his trophies. Investigators described his lack of remorse, his casual attitude about the murders, and his cold efficiency in carrying them out. He eventually pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder, already serving time for a 7th, and received a 360-year sentence that ensured he would die in prison. But the sentence did little to erase the horror of what he had done. Howell was not a charismatic figure like some killers who crave the spotlight. He was an ordinary drifter with an old van, a man who blended into the background of everyday life, which made him all the more frightening. He showed how ruthlessness doesn't require intelligence or notoriety. Sometimes it hides in mediocrity, in someone who looks like no one at all, until it is far too late. For New Britain, the woods behind that strip mall became a permanent scar, a place where the ordinary had collided with the unthinkable. Howell's case remains relatively unheard in the pantheon of American serial killers, overshadowed by more infamous names. But to those who lived through the investigation, he was a reminder that evil often prefers obscurity. He wanted control, he wanted power, and he found both in the quiet isolation of his van. And while his reign ended with a guilty plea and a prison sentence that would stretch beyond any natural lifetime, Europe centuries earlier faced its own monster, a figure who stepped out of famine, myth, and desperation to prey upon children in the forests of France. His name was Gilles Garnier, and in the 1570s he was accused of being not just a murderer, but a werewolf, leaving behind one of the most terrifying legends and criminal cases of its time. In the famine-stricken 1570s, when rural France was gripped by hunger, superstition, and fear, the towns and villages near Dole whispered about a figure who moved through the forests at night, a shadow blamed for missing children whose bodies sometimes turned up mutilated. His name was Gilles Garnier, though many did not speak it at first, because to them he was something far worse, a werewolf. Garnier was a hermit who lived on the edge of the woods with his wife, a man so poor and reclusive that few ever saw him in daylight. His isolation and odd demeanor already made him an outcast, but what pushed him into legend was the trail of children who vanished in his region. In a time when disease, famine, and wolves themselves took countless young lives, suspicion often turned into accusations of witchcraft or lycanthropy. Garnier, with his strange appearance and solitary habits, became the perfect scapegoat. Yet what made the accusations stick were the bodies that began to surface. Children were found in the fields and forests, their small forms bearing brutal injuries that suggested both human and animal savagery. Witnesses later claimed they had seen Garnier luring children away, offering them food before disappearing into the trees. Others testified that they caught sight of him crouched over corpses, tearing at their flesh like a beast. In 1572, Garnier was arrested and put on trial for the murder of at least 4 children, though rumors suggested more. His confessions, extracted under the brutal interrogations common to the era, painted a picture that blurred the line between myth and reality. He admitted to attacking children, to killing them with his hands or with crude weapons, and even to consuming their flesh in acts of cannibalism driven by hunger and madness. The villagers, already primed to believe in werewolves, seized on this as proof that Garnier was not simply a man but a monster in human form. His trial became infamous as one of the earliest recorded werewolf trials in Europe, where superstition and crime collided in a spectacle of horror. Garnier was convicted and burned at the stake, his name forever linked to the legend of the werewolf of Dole. For centuries, his case has hovered between history and folklore, but behind the myth lies the undeniable fact that children died in those woods, murdered by a man whose ruthlessness was amplified by the fear and ignorance of his time. The trial of Gilles Garnier in 1572 unfolded like a grim theater of fear, superstition, and horror, because it was not simply about a man accused of murder. It was about a community desperate to explain a nightmare that seemed beyond human understanding. The famine that gripped France at the time had left families starving, children wandering further from home in search of food, and wolves prowling closer to villages than ever before. When children began to vanish, the people of Dole and the surrounding countryside did not see it as random misfortune. They saw it as evidence of something unnatural, something monstrous. Witnesses came forward claiming they had seen Garnier lurking at the edge of fields, whispering to children or leading them into the woods. Others testified that they had stumbled upon him crouched over small bodies, his hands stained, his mouth smeared, as if he were feasting like a beast. Whether these accounts were fueled by fear, hysteria, or actual sightings, they were powerful enough to condemn him. Under interrogation, Garnier confessed to attacking 4 children, killing them, and consuming their flesh. He described luring them with promises of food, strangling or stabbing them, and then dragging their bodies into the forest. Some reports even claim he admitted to roasting parts of his victims over a fire to share with his wife, though how much of this was truth and how much was drawn from forced confessions remains debated. What is certain is that Garnier's crimes tapped into the deepest fears of his time: the terror of wolves, the belief in shapeshifters, and the idea that hunger could drive men to become monsters. The court labeled him a werewolf, not in metaphor but in earnest, convinced that he had transformed into a beast to commit his murders. His execution, burned at the stake, was as much about purging the supernatural as it was about delivering justice. The legend of the werewolf of Dole spread quickly, told and retold across generations as a warning to children to stay close to home, to never trust a stranger at the edge of the woods. But beneath the layers of folklore lies the reality that Garnier was no myth. He was a man, poor, isolated, and consumed by cruelty, who took advantage of desperate times to commit unspeakable acts. The werewolf trial gave villagers a way to explain the horror, but the truth was perhaps more chilling. Sometimes the monster does not transform under a full moon. Sometimes it is just a man who chooses to kill. The execution of Gilles Garnier in 1573 was meant to bring closure to the people of Dole, but instead it cemented his place in history as one of the earliest figures to blur the line between criminal and legend. Burned at the stake before a crowd of terrified villagers, his death was treated not just as punishment for murder, but as an exorcism of evil itself. Yet long after the flames died down, the story of the werewolf of Dole continued to haunt Europe, retold in whispered warnings to children and in the chronicles of scholars who sought to document the strange intersection of folklore and crime. Garnier's case became one of the most notorious werewolf trials of the 16th century, alongside those of men like Peter Stube in Germany, reflecting how communities used supernatural explanations to make sense of horrors they could not otherwise comprehend. But beneath the superstition was a man whose ruthlessness was undeniable. His victims were children, the most vulnerable members of a society already broken by famine, and his willingness to prey upon them placed him beyond even the most desperate hunger of the time. Historians debate whether Garnier's confessions were exaggerated under torture, whether the details of cannibalism and supernatural transformation were inventions of fearful minds. But what is certain is that real children died, their lives extinguished by a man who became the monster his community needed to imagine. Garnier's story lingers as a reminder of how thin the line can be between myth and reality, and how evil often hides in the shadows of fear and ignorance. Centuries later, on the other side of the Atlantic, another killer would terrify communities not through superstition, but through sheer brute force. In the 1920s, women across the United States and Canada began vanishing in boarding houses, their bodies discovered strangled, their killer described as an unassuming drifter who charmed landladies before revealing the predator within. His name was Earl Nelson, and his reign of terror would earn him the grim nickname, the Gorilla Killer, a man whose strength and savagery turned trust into a death sentence. In the mid-1920s, at a time when America and Canada were roaring with prosperity, jazz clubs, and a sense of modern progress, a predator was quietly moving from city to city, leaving behind a trail of death so brutal that newspapers would later call him the Gorilla Killer. His real name was Earl Leonard Nelson, and though he appeared small and unremarkable to many, those who met him described a strange intensity in his eyes, a darkness that unsettled even before his crimes were known. Born in San Francisco in 1897, Nelson's childhood was marred by tragedy. His parents died young, leaving him to be raised by a stern grandmother who enforced rigid religious rules while he battled head injuries and developmental problems that left him odd and isolated. By adulthood, Nelson had drifted through jobs and institutions, never holding steady work, but honing a predatory instinct that would make him one of North America's earliest documented serial killers. What made Nelson especially chilling was his choice of victims and method of attack. He targeted landladies, respectable middle-aged women who rented out rooms in their homes, often living alone or with little protection. Nelson would pose as a polite, soft-spoken tenant, sometimes carrying a Bible or presenting himself as deeply religious to gain their trust. Once inside, however, the mask dropped. Using brute strength, he strangled them with his hands or with articles of clothing, then left their bodies hidden in their own homes, sometimes under beds, sometimes stuffed into closets. The sheer savagery of his attacks shocked investigators. The sudden violence of a man who seemed at first so quiet contrasted with the ferocity of his hands around a woman's throat. From 1926 to 1927, Nelson's killings spread across multiple states and into Canada, leaving police baffled by the mobility of a killer who struck in one city and then vanished before they could even identify a suspect. His nomadic lifestyle, riding trains, drifting between cheap lodgings and preying on women who opened their doors, made him nearly impossible to track in an era without centralized police databases. For women who advertised rooms to let in newspapers, Nelson became an invisible terror, answering their ads with politeness before turning their homes into their tombs. The nickname, the Gorilla Killer, was coined not only for the ferocity of his grip, but also for the way neighbors often described his hunched posture and unsettling presence, a man whose very physicality seemed out of place yet unforgettable. Earl Nelson's killing spree across the United States and Canada in the mid-1920s revealed just how dangerous a predator could be in an era when communication between jurisdictions was slow, fragmented, and often riddled with blind spots. His pattern was simple, yet devastatingly effective. Nelson scoured newspaper classifieds for rooms to let, carefully choosing landladies who lived alone or with minimal protection. He presented himself as a quiet, religious tenant, often carrying a Bible as a prop, speaking with a meekness that disarmed suspicion. Once he gained entry, however, his demeanor shifted into violence almost immediately. He would strangle his victims with his hands or whatever fabric was closest at hand, leaving them crumpled in their own homes. Many of the women were found stuffed under beds, shoved into closets, or left where they fell, their homes eerily undisturbed aside from the sudden violence that ended their lives. Nelson's mobility made him a ghost to investigators. In one city, police would discover a body with few clues. Days later, another city hundreds of miles away would find the same horrific scene. A landlady murdered, her home turned into a crime scene with strikingly similar details. Between 1926 and 1927, he is believed to have murdered at least 22 women across California, Oregon, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois, and finally into Canada. The press began to connect the murders, dubbing him the Gorilla Killer for his animal-like strength and the savagery of his attacks. Panic spread among women renting rooms, many refusing to advertise or locking their doors against potential tenants. Despite the fear, Nelson continued moving, slipping into cities by train and vanishing just as quickly. His ability to blend into ordinary life, never staying too long in one place, presenting himself as humble and pious, meant that even when witnesses recalled speaking to him, they dismissed him as forgettable, hardly the kind of man they could imagine strangling dozens of women. Authorities struggled to link the cases in real time, and without modern forensic tools or a centralized system, Nelson remained ahead of the law. Each discovery of a body sent shockwaves through neighborhoods, but before police could organize, he was already gone. His spree demonstrated not just ruthlessness, but opportunism. Nelson thrived on society's trust, on the kindness of women willing to offer a room, and he turned that hospitality into his weapon. By 1927, his trail of death stretched so wide that newspapers across North America warned of a killer moving unseen among them, a man who seemed both ordinary and unstoppable, a predator without boundaries who left cities haunted long after he vanished from their streets. By the spring of 1927, Earl Nelson's reign of terror had spread across so many states that his crimes could no longer be ignored, even in a fragmented law enforcement system that struggled to connect the dots. Each new discovery of a murdered landlady carried the same eerie pattern: a polite stranger renting a room, followed by sudden violence and a body concealed under a bed or crammed into a closet. Finally, Nelson's spree reached Canada, where he would meet both his peak and his downfall. In Winnipeg, Manitoba, Nelson struck again, luring women under the same guise of a room-seeking tenant. But this time, Investigators were beginning to see the shape of the predator they were chasing. Witnesses described his unsettling mannerisms, the way he carried a Bible, his hunched posture, his piercing stare, details that matched accounts from previous crime scenes in the United States. When Nelson murdered Emily Patterson, a respected woman in Winnipeg, the city erupted in fear, and police mounted one of the largest manhunts in Canadian history. Nelson was soon captured after attempting to strike again, recognized by his distinctive appearance and strange behavior. At his trial, the sheer scale of his crimes stunned the courtroom. Witness after witness described his method of luring women, his brutality, and his lack of remorse. Prosecutors presented evidence linking him to at least 22 murders, though the true number may have been higher. Nelson himself offered little defense, his demeanor alternating between calm detachment and odd mutterings that suggested a fractured mind. In November 1927, he was convicted and sentenced to death, and on January 13, 1928, Earl Leonard Nelson was hanged at Vaughan Street Jail in Winnipeg. His death ended one of the first cross-border serial killing sprees in North America, but the memory of his crimes lingered long after. For decades, his case was overshadowed by more infamous names that followed, but to historians and true crime scholars, Nelson remains one of the most ruthless killers of the early 20th century, a man who turned the simple kindness of landladies into their downfall, whose brute strength earned him the name the Gorilla Killer. His story closes this dark trio, a reminder that evil takes many forms. The drifter with a van in modern America, the hermit turned werewolf in famine-stricken France, and the polite lodger in 1920s boarding houses. Each of them thrived in obscurity, proving that the most terrifying killers are not always the ones whose names fill headlines, but the ones who move quietly, unseen, until it is far too late. Some killers live in infamy, but others vanish into the shadows of history, their names forgotten, their crimes almost erased. William Howell turned a van into his death chamber. Gilles Garnier became the werewolf of famine-stricken France. Earl Nelson strangled women across 2 nations under the guise of a polite tenant. 3 ruthless killers, 3 haunting truths. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments which story chilled you most.